Hi everyone, and welcome to the lecture video, Creating a Hypothesis. When we create a hypothesis, we're typically about to start an explanatory study using a deductive method. Remember that explanatory studies are about cause and effect. The goal is to determine whether or not the cause is actually creating the effect at all, and if it's creating the effect, under what circumstances does it create the effect, and how much of an effect will the cause have. In research methods, we don't use the classifications cause and effect. Instead, we use the terms independent and dependent variable. The cause is the independent variable because this is the variable that we're going to manipulate in an experiment to see what kind of effect it has on the dependent variable. The best way to remember that is to think that a dependent variable is dependent on what we do with the independent variable. Depending on the research question, we may need to measure both the independent and the dependent variable, or we may just need to measure the dependent variable. I'm going to get into that much more in depth when we discuss experimental design. But for now, just assume that we have to go through conceptualization and operationalization for both variables. There are also control variables. These are variables that other researchers have found to cause change in the dependent variables. So we want to make sure to measure these and to keep them constant as much as possible. For example, if we're conducting the quintessential growing plants with music experiment, we would want to observe how music changes the growth of the plants. Our independent variable would be the music, and our dependent variable would be the plant height. Control variables would be other things that impact the plant height. Things like the amount of water used, the type of soil, the pot in the plants, etc. In some experiments like this one, we can keep control of all the control variables the same. We could plant both plants in the same soil, in the same type of pot, and give them the same amount of water every day. And that way we know that it's being kept constant. But oftentimes in social science, we don't have that ability. So instead, we use method 2, which is to measure the control variables so that we can take them into account when we're doing our data analysis. For instance, this diagram shows a study that looks at the impact of gender on work compensation. The problem is that woman A is different than man A on multiple characteristics, not just gender. So we need to be aware of the other variables that can affect compensation levels. In this study, they're going to measure performance scores, job level, tenure, and job role, as well as gender and compensation. That way, when they analyze their data, they can use those control variables in their analysis, and they can figure out the cause and effect relationship while holding the control variables statistically constant. When you go to set up a hypothesis, you generally won't see the control variables listed, but you will see both the independent and the dependent variables for an explanatory deductive study. I'm sure you've all had practice writing hypotheses back in high school, but this is usually a pretty formulaic discussion, so I want to highlight how to create them for this class. First, a good hypothesis will have 4 elements: who or what you're studying, the independent variable concept, the dependent variable concept, and the expected relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. Now, there are multiple ways to write a hypothesis. The classic method, and the way you might have been taught in high school, was to use if-then statements. If students study, then they will learn higher grades than students who do not study. You do not need to use the if-then format though. I usually use the second format for my hypotheses, which would look like this. Students who study will earn higher grades than students who do not study. Now again, there is no right or wrong, but you need to make sure that your hypothesis contains all 4 elements: who or what we are studying, the independent variable concept, the dependent variable concept, and the expected relationship between the 2 concepts. All right, well, that concludes our lecture on creating hypotheses. Thanks for watching, everyone.